She is quite possibly the last of her kind. Before there was an airplane, there was only one way across an ocean. For most of the 19th and 20th century, the Atlantic wasn't a barrier. It was the busiest road on Earth. Millions crossed it, not for vacation, but because their entire future depended on the other side. Between the 1850s and the 1920s, tens of millions of immigrants left Europe for a new life in the Americas. A ship wasn't a luxury for most of them. It was the only door available. Below decks, families crossed in cramped conditions, gambling everything on a ticket. Above them, first class looked like something else entirely: chandeliers, orchestras, competition for the wealthiest travelers alive. Two experiences, one ship, one ocean. And it wasn't only people. Before transatlantic cables and radio matured, mail crossed the ocean aboard the fastest ships available. Governments and businesses depended on it. A delayed crossing didn't just inconvenience passengers, it delayed contracts and diplomacy on both sides of an ocean. That's why speed became a matter of national prestige, not comfort. Companies raced for the blue ribbon, the unofficial title for the fastest crossing, because a fast ship proved something about a country's industry and ambition. Cunard, White Star Line, the French Line, names that meant as much to the public then as airlines mean today. These weren't leisure companies, they were essential infrastructure. Cunard alone had already lost ships to tragedy and war before any of this reached its peak. RMS Lusitania, one of Cunard's own record-breaking liners, was torpedoed in 1915, a loss that shifted public opinion during the First World War and remains one of the most consequential maritime disasters in history. The company that would one day build Queen Mary II had already learned more than once what the ocean could take from it. By the early 20th century, ocean liners were declarations of national identity, each new ship bigger, faster, and more advanced than the last. It's worth naming the ship most people already associate with this era for the worst possible reason. RMS Titanic wasn't built to sink. It was built like every other liner of its time, for speed, comfort, and a reputation for safety companies advertised aggressively. Its loss in 1912 didn't end the era, it reshaped it. Lifeboat law changed, ship design changed. But for another 4 decades, the fundamental need for ships like her didn't change at all. Then, in October 1958, everything changed at once. Pan America World Airways began regular jet service between New York and London. A crossing that took the better part of a week now took under 7 hours. Not faster, categorically different. The industry didn't decline gradually, it cratered. One by one, the great names of the Golden Age were retired, converted, or scrapped. By the 1960s and 70s, the fleets that had defined a century of travel were almost entirely gone. The ships that survived had to become something else, and that something else gave birth to an entirely new industry. By the 1990s, Cunard was one of the last companies on Earth still operating anything resembling a transatlantic liner service, an aging ship called the Queen Elizabeth II. She was decades old, beloved, historic, and reaching the end of what any ship can reasonably be asked to do. Cunard faced an obvious question: let the tradition quietly end with her retirement, or build something new? Every piece of conventional industry logic said, let it end. Jets had won that argument 40 years earlier. Building a purpose-made ocean liner in the 21st century, when literally no one else on Earth was doing it, looked to most outside observers like nostalgia dressed up as strategy. Cunard, under Carnival Corporation's ownership, disagreed. They committed to a ship that could genuinely maintain scheduled transatlantic crossings while offering the luxury today's passengers expect. Construction began in Saint Nazaire, France, at a cost of roughly $800 million, an enormous bet on a category the rest of the industry had already declared dead. The name tied her directly to that lineage. Queen Mary, too, a deliberate echo of the Golden Age and a statement of intent. This would not be a cruise ship borrowing a liner's name for marketing. This would actually be built like one. In January 2004, she entered service, the longest, tallest, widest, and most expensive passenger ship ever built at the time. But the real story was never the size or the price tag. It was in the engineering choices that followed, choices no cruise line would ever have reason to make. Let's start with the hull. Cruise ships are engineered for calm water efficiency, but Queen Mary II's hull uses thicker steel and heavier framing, built to absorb the repeated stress of North Atlantic swells crossing after crossing. It's the structural difference between a commuter car and one built for a rally across broken terrain. Then there's her bow. It sits noticeably higher above the waterline than a typical cruise ship's, which helps prevent full waves, not just spray, from sweeping the forward decks in heavy seas. It's a risk cruise ships simply avoid by routing around it. Speed matters too, and not in the way you'd think. Most cruise ships cruise comfortably near 20 knots. Queen Mary II can sustain speeds above 30. That's not about luxury, it's about being able to make up time lost to a storm and still keep her schedule, the same promise every ocean liner has always had to keep. Beneath the waterline, a combined diesel and gas turbine electric system drives 4 steerable propulsion pods, delivering enormous power with a precision few conventional shaft-driven ships can match. And when the ocean turns rough, massive retractable stabilizer fins, combined with her weight and hull shape, keep the ride remarkably composed even when the water outside isn't. Underneath all of it is a simple design philosophy. Extensive watertight compartmentalization and redundant systems mean she has to keep functioning no matter what, because there's no sheltered harbor in the middle of the North Atlantic. Every one of those decisions costs money most companies see no reason to spend. Queen Mary II carries all of it permanently because her job demands it every single crossing. Step aboard, and the difference between a liner crossing and a cruise vacation stops being something you're told and becomes something you feel. A Caribbean cruise chases good weather. Queen Mary II, sailing Southampton to New York, does the opposite. She sails into whatever the North Atlantic has that week, and for many aboard, that unpredictability isn't a flaw, it's the experience. Fog one morning, driving rain by afternoon, swells that rock the horizon outside the observation lounge. Then, without warning, a clear night with more stars than most passengers have seen in their lives. No light pollution for 1,000 miles in any direction. On board, Cunard has preserved rituals most modern cruise lines quietly abandoned decades ago. Formal evenings remain a genuine tradition. Black tie, ballroom dancing, a live orchestra. Less cruise entertainment, more a preserved piece of a vanished era still running exactly as it did 70 years ago. She carries the largest library at sea, a planetarium, the only one on any ocean-going ship. Wide observation lounges where passengers spend hours simply watching the horizon because for the length of a crossing, that becomes enough. Behind the formal diners and the quiet lounges, Queen Mary II carries a crew of roughly 1,250 to serve around 2,600 passengers, nearly one crew member for every 2 guests, a ratio closer to a 5-star hotel than a typical cruise ship. Deck officers hold a discipline closer to commercial aviation than leisure cruising. Course speed and schedule track constantly, watch after watch, because arriving in New York on time is still treated as a promise, not a suggestion. Below them, an entire hidden crew: engineers, chefs, housekeeping, entertainers, many of whom sign on for months at a time, living and working aboard the same ship they help keep on schedule mid-ocean far longer than any passenger's 6-day crossing. It's easy to see only the passenger-facing ship, the ballroom, the library, the sunset from the top deck. The crew is the reason any of that keeps functioning while the ship is quite literally alone at sea. Ask passengers why they choose her over a flight, and the answers circle the same idea. The journey isn't an inconvenience before the destination. The journey is the destination. 6 days that force a stillness modern travel almost never allows. For 6 days, roughly 2,600 passengers and 1,200 crew exist somewhere most of the modern world has forgotten how to reach, entirely surrounded by ocean, moving at the deliberate pace of a different century inside a ship built quite literally to survive it. More than 2 decades after she entered service, one question follows her everywhere. If she works profitable, celebrated, consistently full, why hasn't anyone built a second one? The answer isn't mysterious, it's economics. Every one of those engineering decisions, the reinforced hull, the sustained high-speed propulsion, the redundant safety systems, adds enormous cost, both to build and to operate, for a capability that only matters on one narrow route, the North Atlantic crossing. A ship capable of sustaining 30+ knots burns dramatically more fuel than one cruising comfortably at 20. That extra speed only makes sense for a ship that has a schedule to keep. A cruise ship doesn't, so it has no reason to pay for it. Meanwhile, the cruise industry that grew out of the liner era's collapse became extraordinarily good at its one job: profitable leisure vacation at a fraction of the operating cost. There's very little commercial reason for almost any company to build a second true liner when the far more profitable cruise model already exists, proven at scale. Queen Mary too exists because Cunard made a specific, calculated bet that a smaller, more traditional market still existed for genuine liner travel done properly. That bet has paid off. It simply hasn't been large or proven enough to convince a second company to take the same risk. And there's a quieter question underneath that one. What happens to her eventually when Cunard decides her service life is over? History offers 2 paths for a ship like this: permanent retirement and scrapping, the fate of nearly every great liner before her, or preservation as a museum ship, floating hotel, or static attraction, the path a handful of legendary vessels have taken instead. Which path Queen Mary 2 eventually follows hasn't been decided, but it's a decision that, when it comes, will mark the literal end of an era. So the question becomes less about the past and more about what comes next. Could someone build another true ocean liner? Technically, absolutely. The knowledge hasn't been lost. The shipyard that built her still builds enormous, technically ambitious vessels today. What hasn't changed is the economic reality that nearly ended this category in the first place. Air travel remains faster, cheaper, and more convenient for the overwhelming majority of transatlantic travelers, and that gap isn't closing. Which means her future, and the future of true ocean liners generally, likely depends less on need and more on desire. As long as enough travelers keep choosing the 6-day crossing over the 6-hour flight purely for the experience itself, there's a reason for a ship like her to exist. Whether that's ever enough to justify a second one from Cunard or anyone else remains genuinely uncertain. She isn't just a ship. She's an argument that a category of thing the rest of the world declared finished in 1958 doesn't have to stay that way. Not yet, anyway. Every time she leaves Southampton, bound for New York, she carries the last living memory of an entire century of ocean travel.